Right, hello, greetings. It's Thomas Daffern. It's my weekly Sunday talk. And today is December the 6th, which is St. Nicholas's Day. Hence I've got my Santa Claus uniform on. Yeah, it's a important day for Christians, and some countries in Europe and in the Christian world celebrate today as Christmas, effectively, December the 6th, St. Nicholas's Day. I mean, there's two things. Today is the feast of St. Nicholas, and I'm going to talk about that. And also then we have December the 25th, which is Christ's birthday and celebration. So Christ Mass is the 25th of December, but this festival on the 6th of December was always important. And the images of Santa Claus originated on this day. This is the day on which children were given sweets and toys and presents and so on. Now, this was a pan-European custom up until, recent times. And who was St. Nicholas? Okay. It's controversially not, absolutely sure. Like with many of these very early saints, the history is lost in legend and so on. But it looks like he was a bishop from what we now call Turkey, Myra, a little town in south western Turkey, which is a part of the world I absolutely adore. I've been there. Incredible, beautiful beaches. If you get a chance, go. And if we ever get out of lockdown and we get peace back, So, very sacred. He was persecuted. He was a very good man. He was kind to his, flock. He was a bishop. He didn't have airs and graces. He was just a kind man. And he was particularly kind to the children in his flock, and he rescued them if they were being, abused, bullied, whatever. And one of the stories that's come down is that there were three young women, girls, who were about to be, had to become prostitutes. So he gave them enough money for a dowry. You couldn't get married unless you had a dowry in those days. And so he gave them 3 bags of gold as a dowry, which meant they could then find nice husbands and have a great life. So he's famous for that, and many other things. So this was celebrated all over Europe. Then in Holland particularly, it lived on and was taken by the Dutch colonists to New Amsterdam, which is what Manhattan was called in the time of the Dutch. And in the Dutch city of New Amsterdam, they used to celebrate this day, 6th of December, with great fun and festivities. It must have been fun, actually, because of course there's snow and, they were surviving, they were flourishing, they'd been befriended by the Indian tribes who were helping them, teaching them how to hunt and trap and all that kind of stuff. New Amsterdam was Dutch up until really the British under the Duke of York. During one of their Anglo-Dutch wars, he conquered it for the British. But it's an interesting period when the Dutch were there. And we owe Santa Claus to that time. So I think what I'd like to start my talk today by saying is that we should honour the children all throughout the world, who are, we need 1 million bags of gold to save all the girls and all the boys from lives of difficulty and challenge and desperation. Look at what's going on in northern Ethiopia, Tigray, and let alone what's been going on in Yemen and many other parts of the world, in Palestine and in Iraq and Syria. It's complete nightmare for so many kids around the world who are living in shock and horror because their parents have really not managed to make friends with other parents. I think it's adults' fault. Obviously, I'm not blaming kids. I'm blaming adults for not having grown up properly. When you're an adult, you should not, hate, go to war. You should be like St. Nicholas. You should be kind, generous, loving towards the next generation. So let's honour St Nicholas by being like, St Nicholas is. All of us, whether we're men or women or whatever, we can still honour that saintly tradition. Now, it's interesting that it was the Dutch that took it to North America, even though they're a largely Protestant nation and mostly Protestant colonists, because it was a Catholic legend. I've been to Bari in the south of Italy, which is where his remains were taken, eventually, from Turkey to southern Italy. It's a magnificent church in Bari, which is a beautiful port city in the south of Italy, from which I've taken a boat to Greece a couple of times. It's one of my favourite ways to get to Greece. And it's worth looking at, at that church. So I think we need to reconcile Catholic and Protestant on this day. We should, the Catholics are great because they keep the rituals going. They keep the incense burning. They keep the candles alight. They keep the rituals going, including the St Nicholas rituals. I'm sure in Catholic churches all over the world there are masses today for St Nicholas's memory. The Protestants are good because they kind of know what the meaning is. They understand, they've analysed, they've done their homework, they've thought it through at a faith level, and they look at the bigger picture, what does the ritual mean? We need both, of course, just as Muslims need both Shia and Sunni for the same reason. So we Christians need both Catholic and Protestant to put the whole bigger picture together. And then, of course, the whole planet needs, all the religions to really make sense of what's going on the planet at the moment. If you add the Kabbalistic interpretation from Judaism and you add the Sufi interpretation from Islam, the Enlightenment Shunya interpretation from Buddhism, and the perennial green eco spirituality from paganism, you begin to get a global conversation going that can make sense of reality, which is where we're at. We need to make sense of what's been going on this last year in coronavirus lockdown. It's been a catastrophe for the planet, and I think, I hope, I pray we're just beginning to come out of it. That would be the best present the gods could give us. St Nicholas, bless you. Please give us, a vaccine that works, and a route out of this chaos. And children are suffering because their parents are dying, they themselves are dying. And it's not fair, we've all had, the older ones among us have had a good innings, we've had a good life, we've had, hopefully, most of us, we owe it to the younger generation to make the world a little bit better each time. That's the faith I was handed down by my parents, who lived through the horrors of World War II. My mother even lived through World War I. She was born on the 1st of January 1914, so as a young child, baby, she knew that war was going on, which was the beginning of the madness. When I nursed World War I victims, veterans in Canada, that was what opened my eyes to how much work there is to be done on this planet to get us back to a sort of sane world order, if you want. So anyway, okay, that's what I want to say to begin with, the St Nicholas analysis of the situation. The second thing I want to say is that I've been doing my bit this last week on my book on religious maths, and as I've said before, I'm working through this quite pioneering and extraordinary thing, which I hope children will enjoy, slightly older kids who are doing GCSE or A-level maths or equivalents, slightly senior grades, and have a love for mathematics and or for religious studies. It's intended for both cohorts and university level students and beyond. I mean, this is a book that can be read by a bright 16-year-old as well as a postdoctoral professor at Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies, and they would all get something from it. I've written it at the whole level. Really should be taught. I mean, there's so many questions and mathematical puzzles I've set in this book that you really need to have an academic to explain how to go about doing the homework. But bright students will be able to get it themselves without guidance. So what have I been working on this week? Well, I've been absolutely having a ball because it's so interesting, to look at the religious dimensions of mathematics and the mathematical dimensions of religions. It's looking at both. And just to give you a little taster, the topics I've looked at in this last week include, so I looked at archetypal psychology, which is one of my great passions. I'm a Jungian of sorts, and I've always loved the Jungian approach to the collective unconscious and mythology, symbolism, Joseph Campbell, and the making alive of these ancient archetypes. So I've asked lots of mathematical questions about that, how it works, where is the collective unconscious, how big is it, how can we measure it, how many archetypes are there? All those type of questions, fascinating stuff. And I've been musing about this for years, Then I looked at poetics and poetry and religious studies, because I am a poet, as you know, lover of poetry. I think poetry is like another language, so just as mathematics is a sort of language, so is poetry. You might think they don't intersect, but actually they do. I've found some really interesting poems about mathematics. Some poets who use a lot of mathematical symbolism in their poems, like Wallace Stevens, who's one of my favourite of all time poets. He thinks really rationally and mathematically in his poetry style, which inspired me when I was starting out as a young poet. And there are others, nobody's done, the epic poem of all mathematics. I mean, I don't think anybody be able to. That's a very big poem. But anyway, I've given little hints on how poetry and maths intersect. Then I've talked about emotional intelligence. We all know, IQ, it's a good kudos to have a high IQ. I remember when I got mine tested when I was 15 and it showed genius level, I thought that's cool. But what it didn't test was emotional intelligence. And given that my father was dying of Alzheimer's and I was a bit, sad, I probably would have scored low on that. So I'm looking at emotional intelligence and looking at the maths of that. It's been measured, there's various tests being developed. There's no point making you really brainy, a sort of an idiot savant, as they call it, so that you can do, 1 million calculations a minute standing upside down, but you can't talk to your wife or your children properly. We humans have got to learn emotional intelligence as well as cerebral intelligence. And I think it's one of the problems with the way maths is approached and taught, is that it's become too cerebral. I think maths should be fun, enjoyable. The word school in Greek actually meant leisure. A school is what we do for fun. You wouldn't know it if you went around most schools in the world. But actually it should be really fun. And so, whereas most kids find a maths class terrifying, because there's the 5% that totally understand it, they're the people that have got the kind of cerebral brains that can do it immediately. And then there's the rest plodding along trying to catch up on what is this? What is this? Well, and that makes them feel ashamed, it makes them feel guilty, it makes them hide their ignorance, and gets all kinds of emotional bad habits that then stay for the rest of their lives often. And psychologists of maths have been studying this problem with mathematics education as a sort of development of an inferiority complex, because 70% of kids are not geniuses at maths. They can just about do it, but with difficulty and with lots of explanations, So that means about 70% of kids are going to come away from school with an inferiority complex. They're not good enough. They didn't understand it. And that's shocking, because education should be about people having fun, enjoying learning, and coming away with a feeling of, wow, I did that. Yeah, I do understand that. That wasn't too difficult. Whereas what it's become is a sort of hierarchical institution to generate feelings of inferiority and shame and deceit, because if you don't understand something, you don't tell anyone, you just pretend you understand it. And that's what our institutions have become. Well, that's completely wrong. St. Nicholas would say, for God's sake, shut them all down. Let's start again with the kids. First and foremost, we're trying to make them happy to be alive, to be here. Thanks for coming to visit this planet. Thanks for being my child, my daughter, whatever. This is how the world works. These are these things called maths, English, French, geography. Let's enjoy mastering those. And then maths education would be totally transformed, and it would talk from the heart, and it would work with the kids' intuitive understanding of what numbers are, which is their abstract thoughts in the mind of God, to put it in Platonic language. And if you explain that properly to a child, they'll get it immediately, because that's not that difficult. And it means that it's great fun to then, learn how they work. Anyway, that's what I've been working on this week. Emotional intelligence, mathematics and religions. Complex, but fascinating. Then I looked at history. Obviously, I have a PhD in history. I'm a historian. I've taught history of ideas. That's my specialism. But I love all of history. I used to belong to the History of Mathematics Society in London. And I used to host meetings for them at the Institute of Education, which is hot on maths education. Most maths education doesn't include history, and I think this is terrible. I think instead of showing kids how to do algebra as if it's some sort of like a thing you do, no, explain the history of it. This came from Baghdad, this came from Islamic thinkers, this came by joining Greek geometry to Indian numbers, this came from a breakthrough idea that some geniuses had. Building on earlier foundations. Explain how maths changes and evolves through different generations and eras. It's not a static thing. Come back 500 years, they'll be learning a whole different kind of maths. So that is kind of what I was doing. I was looking at the history and what history can say about religions and maths. And of course, it's vitally important in religions, because just as mathematical knowledge transforms and changes every few hundred years, well, actually a few decades, so religious knowledge does it. You have new religions come along, new religious movements, new teachers, new interpretations, new hermeneutics, and it's always changing and shifting. And yet the fundamental core insights stay the same, just as the core fundamental numbers of maths, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. They're constant throughout all the ages. So right, wrong, truth, love, justice, peace, those values in religious and moral education remain constant. But the way they're calibrated and the way they're interfaced and the way they're, calculated each generation changes. Then I looked at spiritual intelligence, which is another hugely interesting field. It's like an outgrowth or development beyond emotional intelligence, because there is such a thing, they've discovered now, as spiritual intelligence. Some people have it more, some people, seem to lack it to some extent. It's the ability to perceive the uncanny, to follow the path of weird, to use the Anglo-Saxon word for karma. To perceive the invisible. The Taoist sage talks about how a sage is always attending to the invisible, not the visible, because the visible is already manifest. What we should be working on is what's about to manifest, which is the invisible currents of energy that we can perceive only through spiritual intelligence. And it's very closely linked to moral or ethical intelligence, knowing that if I do such and such an act, it's going to have a disastrous effect on somebody, so I won't do it. That's the fundamental rule of moral intelligence. Well, that's one of the first rules you have to master to be any good at spiritual intelligence. And all the great teaching systems like Hinduism, the Upanishads, you can't become a student of yoga unless you first adopt the ethical rule of non-violence, ahimsa. Only when you accept non-violence of thought, word and deed are you fit to even begin to study yoga, and Yoga Vedanta, the highest form of yoga. So that's where moral intelligence and spiritual intelligence come together. It's the same in Buddhism. Buddha taught a path of ethics which then lead to the accumulation of spiritual intelligence. Same with Christ. Christ taught, love your neighbour as yourself, the beginning of the rule, and the Lord God, with all your heart, mind and soul. And it's interesting, he said all three, like your emotional intelligence, your intellect, and your spiritual intelligence. Love God with all three. And that means, by the way, cultivate them, understand them, and deepen your knowledge of them, which is what I'm doing in this book. And then, all will be opened up to you. Knock and you shall seek. Christ was someone who'd obviously been a really devoted, spiritually intelligent kind of guy, and had been working on this for a long time before he starts teaching in his early 30s. So that was that. I've also looked then at the question of disciples, apostles, and students. Every religion has, named disciples. Like we know who the 10 biggest, most important disciples of Buddha were. We know who the 12 most important disciples and apostles of Christ were, plus others. There were others like Mary Magdalene, St. Paul, and so on that were additional. And we know in the Jain case who were the most important disciples of Mahavira. We know the disciples and followers of Guru Nanak who found the Sikh religion. And so on. Every religion has a sort of lineage of disciples and apostles. What I looked at in the book is how we can number them, how we know them, how we can deal with the problem that sometimes, sadly, maybe a couple of generations down the road, some of these disciples fall out. You have lineage battles going on between, I was the top disciple. No, I was. Well, I only met him 3 times. You met him 4, so I'm the top one. Etc., etc. And sometimes these become great wars in history. And then it's complicated by the fact that some religions say that you can contact the spiritual master out of body even though he's long dead. So you might be in the 13th century and think that you've now got a download about what Christ really meant that makes you the top disciple. And then, or like Luther, you can say, no, I fully understand everything, so everything the church is teaching is wrong. Let's start a whole new brand of Christianity called Lutheranism, and we'll destroy the other churches, etc. So that's a problem. That triggered the 30 Years' War, for God's sake, which was the most horrendous war in Germany, lasting 30 years of chaos, mayhem, butchery, and madness. Only, it was the resistance against that madness that gave birth to Leibniz, Spinoza, Descartes, and the intellectual revolution that brought us the Enlightenment. And brought us some very, advanced philosophy and maths. So I've looked at this problem of disciples and apostles, and how you can measure the veracity of them. It's interesting, mathematically. Then I looked at churches and chapels scattered around the world, how many there are. Like, it's a really interesting mathematical question. Including ashrams, temples in India, China. There's a lot. So what are they all for? How many people are working and living there? How many go to these churches? What do they do with them? Could they be, why are they destroyed during times of war? They're often bombed or burned. We've even seen that recently, tragically, in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. So there's lots of interesting mathematical questions about the plant of religion, so to say. And Druids and pagans like to worship out in nature, in the woods, when it's warm enough. And so where are their sacred sites? They grew into things like Stonehenge and Avebury, but before that they were just, meeting places in the woods. And they're also sacred. Well, how many are they of them? The temple of Odin at Uppsala was initially a sort of forest sanctuary, and it grew into proper temples and things. So those all need, cataloguing and classifying. I think they should all be on the special index of do not bomb. There should be a sign, which is what Resurrect tried to do, to get this 3-pointed sign above all these abbeys and churches during wartime. Obviously the solution is to just abolish war, and that's what I'm working on. Then I looked at religious orders, again mathematically, how many orders are there in the world, which religions have them, what numbers are there. I think the Jesuit order is the most numerous of Christian orders. It's not very numerous, it only has about 16,000 members, including the current Pope. They're quite clever, the Jesuits, and I've gone into their history, over the years quite a lot. And they were some brilliant mathematicians as well. Dominicans, okay, there's a few of them, but I have a slight problem with the Dominicans' sort of arrogance about knowledge. I like Meister Eckhart and Aquinas and Albert the Great, and I mean there are many great Dominican intellectuals, but I'm having problems with their approach to knowledge, which is that knowledge is a received thing that comes and you can't question it. I'm much more with Raymond Lull, the earlier generation of Christian intellectuals, that there's nothing that can't be questioned. There has to be freedom of thought, or it's not actually properly religion, as Kant pointed out. It's just a kind of dogma that you inherit. So, and the Cathars, that's why they were grumbling about what the Dominicans were doing, setting up their Inquisition. I don't think Inquisitions should be allowed in any religion. So there's a conversation there, but anyway, I look at it all, no holds barred. This is a scientific study of religion and maths. How many Dominicans gave support to torture, would be a mathematical question. Too many is the answer. What about how many orders are there now for Mary Magdalene? There's a few. I mean, I run the Mary Magdalene Studies Association. Mary Magdalene was on the opposite wing of the church. She was in the Gnostic church. Did Christ empower her to set up her own lineage or order? How can we know? I suspect so. I think Thomas was in that branch of the church, the original apostle of the more Gnostic variety. So there's some interesting questions. And nowadays there are springing up sort of Mary Magdalene type study groups and and theological centres. There's one in Oxford under the old Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. Well, that's all good stuff. And there are many orders. And in Buddhism, of course, there are the wonderful Nyingma orders of Tibet, the Gelugpa orders, and all the various Zen orders in Japan. They're all amazing, and they all have secrets to share. And one can ask mathematical questions about them. How many people reach enlightenment in any given order, in any given decade? It's a fair question. I mean, that's surely the goal of all these orders. Are they doing enough, What about in the Freemasonic orders? There again, I've looked at them mathematically. Okay, then I looked at a really interesting topic of messiahs, avatars, and the Sehershant, which is the Zoroastrian idea for a messiah. And it's the actual origin of the concept of a messiah. Scholars who've really gone into this, and I'm, just a beginner in all things, but I've gone into it a lot, agree that the concept of messiah, which is what Christians call Christ is the Greek translation of the word messiah, is actually a Zoroastrian idea, the Sehershant, who's going to come and make everything right. He's going to defeat evil. And this apocalyptic struggle between good and evil was the Zoroastrian founding religion idea of Zoroaster, who was a sage of ancient Persia about 1700 BC. At the time, the Vedas were coming down into the north of India. Similar types of people. He probably smoked a bit too much Homa, Haoma, which gave him these visions. I mean, he was quite a character with Zoroaster. And, he had some good trips and bad trips, and he saw the negative, the diabolic, and he was absolutely determined to destroy it and defeat it. And for that, he invoked the Sehershant, who was going to come and finish off the job. Initially, Zoroaster was the Sehershant, but later, when he died, his followers said, well, the Sehershant's still coming. And that then was passed down through the texts and through word of mouth and so on. So that when the Jews got to Babylon and they were in exile and they met these lovely Persians who set them free, they fell in love with their idea of the saviour, the Sehershant. They thought the Persian kings must be, in the running to qualify. And they became great, lovers of all things Persian, including the Messiah idea. But that was sort of underground. The word Messiah never occurs in the whole Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible. the Hebrew word Messiah doesn't occur in the entire Hebrew Bible. That I think is very interesting. What it does is it infiltrates Gnostic Judaism. It comes as the concept of the Son of Man into the book of Daniel, and it comes into the books of Enoch. And so I've gone into the mathematics, how many references, how often does it appear in all these books, how often does it appear in that undertow of esoteric Judaism. That's where it came. And the idea in the book of Enoch is that there is this heavenly throne room where Enoch gets access to and goes on visits and can talk to God, the intelligence that created the universe, or at least our part of it, and then is sent back down to earth to teach us humans how to behave. And Enoch becomes a sort of messenger going back and forth, and he's referred to as the Son of Man. Now, when Christ starts his teachings, there's a bit of an ambiguity about what was his self-evaluation. Did he really think in his heart of hearts, I'm the Son of God? As later Christian theologians argued. I'm not absolutely convinced that's the case. I think if you look at the psychology of Jesus, I think a precocious, brilliant young man, I think he accessed the book of Enoch at some point early on in his career before he started teaching. We know that it was around because it was found in the Qumran texts. The fragments they found in Qumran from Jesus' very lifetime show they were all reading the book of Enoch. And he uses the phrase, the Son of Man, to describe himself. If you stop Jesus and say, who are you? He said, I'm the Son of Man. Now that's a sort of ritualistic phrase that's in the book of Enoch, and it's explained in there. And everything Jesus does is really taken from the book of Enoch as his manual on how to be a Messiah, right? So read it, read the book of Enoch, and if you have time, listen to my commentary on it, which I recorded when I lived at the castle in Scotland for 7 years. I spent a year recording this work on the books of Enoch, because you're in for a treat. There's not just one book of Enoch, there's 3. And I'm sure the first one was read by Christ. I mean, I can prove it in the commentary. The second one was written at the time of Christ. He may or may not have had access, but it's very much overlapping with his thought world. And the third one was written some little while after, but is very much at the dawn of the Kabbalah. And it's very interesting. It's, very Kabbalistic. So the 3 books of Enoch are all amazing. Anyway, I went into this thing in detail. Then I look at avatars and what is it? How do you qualify to be an avatar, to be accepted as an avatar? I mean, Rama is an avatar, but how did he do a contest? I mean, do you have to defeat the evil demon to be a avatar? Seems to be. You have to do some major work. Well, where are they now? Where are our avatars now? We need them now. We need a couple to defeat pandemic. We need a couple to get rid of mad politicians that lie, like Boris Johnson and Trump. Where are the avatars of truth and love? Was Mahatma Gandhi one? What's the difference between a Mahatma and an avatar? How do you calibrate the respective weight of this guru who's got thousands of followers doing great work and I love him very much, or her, and an avatar, like an avatar is something really, really important. There's only been 9 of them in the whole of history, apparently. But the 10th is expected. Kalki's coming soon, and he's been coming soon for a long time. Well, how bad does it have to get before he actually shows up, is the kind of question I've been asking here. And the same with the Jewish expectations of a Messiah. There's a wonderful book by a rabbi in New York called The Messiah Isn't Coming, and You're Him, which is a great title.